Welcome to our author talk with Nick Davis. Nick Davis is a writer, director, and producer. His most recent film is Once Upon a Time in Queens about the 1986 New York Mets. He lives in New York City with his wife and daughters, and he's joining us today all the way from New York. His book, Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait, was just nominated for the LA Times Book Prize, and we're very excited that he's joining us this evening. Without further ado, please let's welcome author Nick Davis.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you all for joining remotely from wherever you are. It's kind of great to be here in Beverly Hills, even remotely, since that is the scene, the setting of so much of this book. These two men, Joe and Herman Mankiewicz, lived and worked in Hollywood, and Herman's daughter, Johanna, my mother, actually grew up much of her time in Beverly Hills, and we'll get to that. So I've actually, I am not a slideshow maker, but I did make one for this talk, and we will be, I'll be trying to illustrate some of the talk with the slideshow. We'll do that first, and then I'll just expound for a little bit about the book and how it came into being, and then we'll have questions. So I guess the first thing I do get asked a fair amount is, here's the book. Where did you get the title, Competing with Idiots? And the title is, and here we go. I'm now going to share the screen. The title, Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait. The title, Competing with Idiots, comes from a telegram that Herman Mankiewicz, who was a Hollywood screenwriter, sent back from Hollywood to New York to his friend Ben Hecht, pictured there. And the telegram, Herman was one of the first of the New York writers lured out to Hollywood by the money out there. And he sent back a telegram to his friend Ben Hecht when he got out there, and he just loved it. He loved the most of all, he loved the money, but he also really loved the weather. And he sent back a telegram saying, will you accept $300 per week to work for Paramount Pictures? The 300 is peanuts. There's millions to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. So he sent that to Ben Hecht, who's the man there with the hat, and their two wives, Sarah over on the far left. That's my grandmother. We call her Goma, or I called her Goma. And Rose Hecht is over there. And so that's the title of the book, Competing with Idiots, because that is this sort of theme of the book. It's competition, and it's thinking that you're better than everyone else. So, and it's really about these two Hollywood figures, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz. So, if this were just a normal biography, I would say, well, here's who Herman Mankiewicz was. He was a larger-than-life screenwriter and wit, drank himself into an early grave, and was the picture of conviviality as seen here. And he lived his life in a way that was larger than life, so much so that he was the subject of last year's David Fincher movie, Mank, starring Gary Oldman. And then his younger brother, Joe, was in many ways a far more successful Hollywood figure, pictured here in the mid-50s with his pipe firmly clenched between his jaws. And he directed a string of very, very successful movies, most the pinnacle of his career being in the years 1949 and 1950, when in an unprecedented and never to be topped, it could be reached, but it's never going to be topped, accomplishment, he won Oscars for Best Writing and Directing for back-to-back years for Letter to Three Wives and All About Eve. So that's who these two guys were, and if just sort of that's the sort of overall gloss of who they were. But I have a somewhat privileged or cursed view of them. And when I was growing up, what I knew, and I'm talking about 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, what I knew was that your grandfather, Herman Mankiewicz, wrote the greatest movie of all time, Citizen Kane. Here he is with Orson Welles. and was the funniest man who ever lived, and the smartest man who ever lived, and the warmest man who ever lived. And yes, Nikki, I would be told, it's really tragic that he drank himself into an early grave, but he was the greatest guy of all time. And then there's your Uncle Joe, your great Uncle Joe. And what you know about your great Uncle Joe, if you're little Nikki Davis, is, well, first of all, you don't see him very much. In fact, I saw Joe, I would say 2 or 3 times that I can remember as a kid. And he lived less than an hour away from us in New York City. And I thought, just in the way that kids just sort of grab onto anything, I thought, well, the reason for that must be because Joe, unlike Herman, who made the greatest movie of all time, well, he wrote it with Orson Welles. Oh, there's some credit battle. I don't know what that's about, but my grandfather wrote the greatest movie of all time. But Joe made the worst movie of all time, Cleopatra. And so probably the reason we don't see him is there's just a lot of shame surrounding that because it's just the worst movie ever. So that's what I sort of inherited. The air I breathed was full of that notion of these 2 guys, which is a very, childish and sort of cartoon-like, way of thinking of people. But, I was a kid. And I got that viewpoint from my mother, pictured here in 1939, sitting on Herman's lap. My mother clearly adored and even worshiped her father. Despite the fact that he had died when she was but 15, and I think she had complicated feelings for the fact that he drank himself into an early grave. But she loved him dearly and was always telling stories about funny things he had done and funny things he had said, and practically everything out of his mouth was like just some incredible bon mot that needed to be written down by someone. And yet, despite that, we didn't see Joe. And yet here's Joe on her wedding day. By the time my mom got married to my father on this day in 1959, Herman had died, and Joe kind of took over as a surrogate father, and he paid for the wedding. He was very successful. Now, Herman was constantly drinking and gambling, and he would have some periods of earning a lot of money, but then he would squander it and gamble it. And very often, my mother and her family had to move out of their house on Tower Road and rent it out and stay in the school district and find a much cheaper place to live, because Herman he could not hold on to a job. He could not hold on to money. But by 1959, when she's getting married, look, there she is with her great Uncle Joe, and he's great. He pays for a trip to Europe, and it seems like he's a terrific guy. So something must have happened in their relationship. And at this point, when I'm a little kid, I had no idea what, because it was always Herman, pictured here as a young boy in New York City, who was always held up as like, well, this is the guy. This is the guy you want to be. He's amazing and adorable. And oh, by the way, Nick, you maybe sort of look a little like him. And here's Nick with my mom in 1971, and here's Herman. And it's not for me as a 6-year-old to say I don't look like that guy, but maybe I do. And so that was kind of my sense of Joe until I was 23 years old and out in the world. And having graduated from college with little or no idea what to do with myself, one afternoon, my dad said, "Hey, they're honoring your great Uncle Joe at the French consulate. Do you want to come along?" And I thought, honoring Joe? You mean the guy who made Cleopatra? And I mean, I was aware that Joe had won all these Oscars. I was aware of a whole bunch of other movies. But I just didn't think that he was, even remotely close to what he clearly was, which is one of the most successful and gifted filmmakers of the 20th century. But I went along to the French consulate and I met Claudette Colbert. I didn't take this picture, but I did meet Claudette Colbert on that day. And she was very charming and wonderful. And more important, I met Joe. And Joe was warm and self-deprecating, and they gave him this little ribbon and he pinned it to his thing, and he spoke a few extemporaneous remarks that were self-deprecating and funny, and then afterwards I talked to him a little bit, and he held my hand. And he reminded me incredibly of my Uncle Frank, who I loved, one of my mother's brothers. And he reminded me of my mom. And in the intervening years, sadly, my mom had died. She passed away when I was 9 in 1974. So I had never gotten past those sort of very cartoon-like visions of who these two men were. Until that day at the French consulate, when I started to think, wait a minute, this is a real guy and he's wonderful. And the French are giving him this award and he seems terrific. So what's going on here? And here's another great picture of Joe that I just love. And he's clearly like a Menschy guy or seemed like a Menschy guy. So what's going on? And I think that the answers, and I'll get into this when we get past the slideshow, but the answers to what was going on with Joe and with Herman all stem from their father, Franz Mankiewicz, who was a very stern German, was a German immigrant, and was a disciplinarian and a professor and a brilliant professor and teacher in New York City public schools for a long time. But it's that face above the mantle there, and that's Joe's mantle with the 4 gleaming Oscars on it. That was, who dominated these two men's lives. Joe was 11 and a half, almost 12 years younger than Herman. So Herman bore the brunt of Franz's incredibly constant disapproval. And the story was often told, if you brought home a 97 on a test, what happened to the other 3 points? And you can imagine that being said with a little bit of irony or like a sort of, hey, what happened to the other 3 points? It was not said that way. It was said, what happened to the other 3 points? You did not do your best. What's going on? And if you did manage to get an 100, you were certainly never praised for it. It was like, that's expected. And God forbid this man would ever tell you that he loved you. He did love you, but he would never say it. So what drove these two men, Herman and Joe, all came from having a father who you could never satisfy. You could never live up to these incredible standards. So for Herman, he would fight with Franz constantly, and they were big yelling, constant screaming fights in an attempt to win his father's love. Here, when they lived in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, at one point, Herman had this beloved bicycle for a brief moment in time before it was stolen. And as punishment, Franz did not replace this bicycle. And that bicycle became transmogrified or whatever into a sled. And was sort of the inspiration for Rosebud in Citizen Kane, was this bicycle that was sort of the symbol of the parental love that you can never get. In Herman's case, it was a bicycle. In Charles Foster Kane's case, it was, spoiler alert, a sled. And no matter how much you did succeed in the world, and here's Herman with his Oscar for Citizen Kane, it's never going to fill the hole at the center of your being, which is created by having a father who is never going to admit that he loves you, and nothing you do can ever measure up. Herman said at one point, at a certain point, I stopped trying. And you just say, stick it. I'm not even going to try anymore. And one of the tragedies for Herman Mankiewicz's life is that he thought everything he did was beneath him. He thought that he should have always been doing something better. So even writing allegedly the greatest movie of all time, did not make him feel any better about himself. When he was in New York as a journalist, he felt he should have been writing plays. When he was trying to write plays, he felt he should have been doing better journalism. Then he goes out to Hollywood, and the whole time he's there, he thinks these screenplays that he's writing are beneath him, and he should be back in New York writing a novel or being a Walter Lippmann type columnist. He never felt that what he did measured up. And to some extent, the same is true for Joe. And Joe even put the Oscar, put an award at the center of his great masterpiece, All About Eve. And the curious thing about these two guys' careers is Herman is, 11 and a half, 12 years older. He gets out to Hollywood. He is, for a time, he's the first great screenwriter out there, and is the highest paid guy in town. And he is, beloved, and everything he says is so great. And he, the early screenplays, are not really written. They're shouted into existence in story conferences. And that was perfect for Herman's sort of improvisational wit, because Herman didn't like to write anything down. He was, in his own mind, such a genius that everything he said was so great and somebody else should write it down and shape it into something. But that kind of sort of dogged determination of, I'm going to construct a screenplay and write it properly and stuff, that was not something that he cared a lot about. A couple of years later, Joe, then 19, they both graduated from Columbia at ridiculously young ages. He doesn't know what he's going to do, and he bums around in Berlin for a little bit of time, as Herman had spent some time in Berlin. And Herman then sends a telegram to Joe, says, this one isn't quite as witty. For Christ's sake, come on out to Hollywood. So Joe goes out to Hollywood, and there's a steady ascent as Joe is learning the craft. The first wave of Hollywood screenwriters out there did not think very much of movies and didn't take any of it very seriously. The second wave, and Joe is one of them, did take it seriously. And they thought, well, this is a craft. This is a great art form. This is a business. I'm going to learn how to do this. And so Joe steadily ascended in Hollywood. He was told by Louis B. Mayer, you have to crawl before you can walk. You have to walk before you can run. You can't just start off being a director. You have to produce. So Joe produced, and he produced The Philadelphia Story and Fury and a ton of terrific movies in the late 30s and early 40s. Then he turned to writing and directing. He again started with sort of simpler things, and then gradually his screenplays became richer and more complex, reaching the apotheosis, I would say, in All About Eve, which is that's his masterpiece. And so what is that movie about, All About Eve? Well, it's about a younger, cold, calculating, ambitious artist who takes down the older artist, who is more charismatic, more beloved, more charming, but Eve Harrington, pictured just over to the left of Joe, takes down Margot Channing, Bette Davis, much in the same way, it could be argued, that Joe felt he was taking down Herman, because as Joe is rising, Herman is going down. Despite the success of Citizen Kane, which actually wasn't such a huge financial success, Herman's career was a steady descent from the early 30s when he was at the top of the game. Eventually, he's fired by every studio in town, and in fact, at one point, I think it was Dory Sherry, whose daughter, Jill Robinson Sherry, was a really close friend of my mom's, and I think did an event at Beverly Hills Public Library not too long ago. Dory Sherry said, not only are you fired from this studio, Herman, I'm going to make sure you never are hired by any studio in town. And Herman said, promises, promises. So Herman, that was Herman Mankiewicz. To a T. So anyway, it is the contention of the author of this book and the grandson of one of these men and the great nephew of the others, that All About Eve is essentially an emotional autobiography on Joe's part. And one of the great regrets of the book, of my life, is that I didn't get a chance to ask Joe about this, although I know what he would have said. He would have said it's bullshit and you're overreaching and it's not true. which is curious because Joe really was an early devotee and proponent of psychoanalysis. So he liked thinking about this, and his characters are unbelievably psychologically rendered, very sensitively rendered with deep psychology. And I just saw All About Eve again the other day, and it's such a brilliant movie, and the characters, especially the female characters, are so well drawn and have such there's such perspective coming from the maker of this movie. He understands their psychology, but he would certainly think he had nothing it's not an original idea, this thing about All About Eve. And in the 70s, somebody put it to him like, well, what do you think about it? And he said, no, Herman had nothing to do with All About Eve, almost deliberately misunderstanding the question. And it's terribly sad. So I started this never having seen my grandfather in action. Joe, you can see on YouTube and stuff, and there's all kinds of stuff, but not too long ago, somebody sent me this video, and it's just, it's a wonderful little thing where it's from Home Movies in the mid 30s. Somebody had taken a camera out to Catalina Island, and it was a bunch of Hollywood types just on a boat, and Herman is one of them. And this is the first time I ever saw my grandfather was watching this little footage, and there he is. That's the great hero sucking in his belly, and you can see he's very, he's very charming, and sort of. Well, I don't want to read too much into this, but he carried with him an aura of doom and a feeling like nothing is ever really going to work out for me. And it's very sad. He's 38 years old here, and he certainly looks older. And anyway, that's the 29 seconds that we have. From Herman. And I'm going to stop the sharing now and return to this portion. And so I wanted to just say a couple of things about how I wrote this book and how I didn't write this book, because for many, many years, I didn't write this book. And then I'll take questions. When you grow up with these two very titanic figures, at least in my head, it can be sort of daunting. And what's interesting is when I was growing up, I did not feel like Herman had been a success at all, because I would go to a bookstore and I flip through the back of the book and see, they've got Herman Mankiewicz. He's listed on 3 pages, but he wasn't, Cary Grant. And because he had died at such an early age, although, when I was a kid, 55 did not seem that early. And pictures of Herman at that age, he looks at least in his 60s, if not 70s. And there'd never been any money. It's not like we were, living high on the hog because we had all this Citizen Kane money. There was no Citizen Kane money. And if there had been, we wouldn't, he would have gambled it away anyway. And because Joe was such a distant figure and we had no real relationship to him, I never felt like at all oppressed by their success. I thought, well, these two guys just didn't really work it out. But nonetheless, I was trying to figure out, well, who were they really, especially from that moment that I met Joe at the consulate. And at that point, my father told me a somewhat dispiriting story about something that Joe had done to him, done to my mother shortly before her wedding, actually less than a year before that photo was taken, where Joe had 3 wives over the course of his life. And his second wife was an Austrian actress named Rosa Stradner, who came to this country in the late 30s as a sort of Greta Garbo wannabe. And it didn't work out for her. Her accent was just a little flat, and she just not everybody gets to be Greta Garbo. And so she became a very frustrated kind of housefrau for Joe, and also had some serious emotional problems. She may well have been classified as manic depressive if she saw somebody today. But at the time, she was just in and out of sanatoriums all the time. And so my mother would step in her early 20s as the sort of hostess for events and stuff. And at the Joe Mankiewicz house in New York City. And one Saturday afternoon, I guess I'm just going to tell this story. This is the story that begins the book. One Saturday afternoon, she returned home and had these messages from her Uncle Joe saying, call me. She calls and he says, I can't reach Rosa up at our country estate in Mount Kisco. Come with me. Let's go up. We'll drive up and see what's going on. So she goes up to the Park Avenue apartment. They get in the car. They drive up to Mount Kisco. They get to Mount Kisco. Joe says, "You check upstairs. I'll stay down here." And she goes upstairs and finds, unsurprisingly, I think if you're listening to this story, that it finds the dead body of her aunt, and who has committed suicide. And I think it took my mom a couple of years before she sort of started to realize, like, well, wait a minute, why didn't he just go up and check on her himself? And why did I have to go up? Why did I have to go upstate? And why did I have to go upstairs? And he must have known she was dead or was worried about it. And why did he do that to me? Well, I think he did that to her because these two men, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, were competing with each other constantly and competing in general to see who could be the most successful, the most funny, the most witty, the best, win the award. Even though they both knew, it's the center of All About Eve that, you put that award where your heart ought to be. That success in those kinds of competitions is never really going to do you any good. It's never really going to make you whole. But nonetheless, that was what drove them both. And it's very sad and it's very tragic. And I think that hearing that story is what prompted me ultimately many years later to write this book, because I thought, well, wait a minute. Who were these two guys, and why were their lives so unhappy when it seemed like they had it all and it could have been so happy and successful in so many ways? And so I decided, first of all, I'm not a writer. God forbid I should call myself a writer, because I can't compete with those two guys, but I'm a filmmaker. I'm a documentary filmmaker. So I'll do a documentary about these two guys. So in, 2002, I go to American Masters. So it's only 20 years ago. I go to American Masters, the PBS strand, and I say, hey, I'd like to do a documentary about these two figures, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, who are relatives of mine. And here's this theory that I have about All About Eve. And by the way, at that point, this theory actually came not from me, but from my wife. My wonderful wife, Jane, and I were watching All About Eve. And she saw the behavior of Margot Channing and Eve Harrington. And she said, well, wait a minute, that's Joe writing about himself. And I thought, sure, I'm glad I married this woman. So I tell this to American Masters and they say, oh, that's a good idea. Here's a teeny tiny bit of development money. Why don't you start doing some research? So I did a bunch of research. I interviewed my cousins and my uncles on audio tape only. They didn't give me enough money for a camera. And I was very excited about this as a possible documentary. And you'd get the clips from All About Eve, you get the clips from Citizen Kane. This will be great. And then that winter of 2002, I was at a Christmas party and mentioned to a friend who's a book agent, here's what I'm working on. And he said, well, let's do a companion book. And I thought, yes, okay, I can do a companion book because I'm not really writing that. The book will write itself while I make this documentary. So needless to say, that documentary has not yet been made. It was too expensive to afford all those clips for Citizen Kane and everything else. And Susan Lacey, the head of American Masters, was great. And for years, we struggled to get the money, but we never did. But in the meantime, I had signed this contract for a book. So now I had to do it. And I didn't want to do it. I never wanted to write this book. And yet I had this contract. And so from 2003, for years, people would say, "Hey, you doing that book?" I'd be, "Oh yeah, I'm doing that book." Well, I sort of was, but it was very boring. I did not like the book that I was writing. It was essentially the Wikipedia entry of these two guys' lives. And I found it very dull, and it put me to sleep to write. The research was always fascinating, but some of the writing was not going well at all until I had what at the time I thought was a brilliant idea. It later turned out to, well, it was an idea that led to the proper idea. But I thought, oh, I know how to fix this book. I will write the book not as a dual biography. I will write it as the biography of three men, Herman and Joe and me. So, because I know all about me and I love to tell my story. So I wrote the book out, and I went back and forth between all these parallels. Joe did this and I did that, and Herman got fired here and I got fired there. And so there was, I gave it to my editor, and I thought I was done. We're finished. It's 2012 and I finished the book. And she said, "Great. Well, this is what you needed to do in order to write the book. Now take yourself out of it." And for a long time, I kicked and screamed and said, "No, this is the book it has to be," And she didn't want a book about the three of us. And frankly, nobody does. So I did one afternoon, I just said, well, let me just take out all the chunks about me. And I did that, and I saved all that and put it in a drawer. And then I read the book straight through, and I realized, aha, this book is no longer boring. This book has a perspective. This book is coming from someplace, and it's coming from the author, from me. And it wasn't this sort of I'm trying to be objective thing. And at that point, I realized this is not a dual biography; it's a dual portrait. So the subtitle is Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait, not a dual biography, a dual portrait. And to me, that's very crucial, because other people can and even have written books about these two men. But this is my version. And anybody doesn't like it, they can write their own version. This, my fingerprints are, for good or ill, everywhere in this book. It is my story, or it's my version of their story. And people said, well, what do you think of David Fincher's Mank? And what I love best about it is that Herman is now, a figure in the national imagination. And so David Fincher has his version of Herman Mankiewicz, and I have my version, and my cousins and nephews or whoever, a lot of us are writers, and they can do their own versions. So that is in a nutshell. And so anyway, once I read the book over again, having taken myself out of it, I still had many years to go just in terms of the writing of it. But at least I knew what the book was. And so I was able to write from that point on and finish the book. So I think I've covered everything that was in my notes, but as must be obvious, I could talk about these two guys forever. I will say this: the other thing I want to make clear about Herman Mankiewicz, and the difference between the two of them is Herman was his goal in life, I think, was to be talked about and to live a life of such improvisational genius that the life itself would be the ultimate work. I think at some point late in life, he realized, well, that didn't get me anything. But the difference between these two guys, and they were both supremely talented, is that spark of constant originality is what drove Herman, Whereas what I think drove Joe was, let me apply myself to forming, great screenplays and becoming a good director and making, great movies. But to the end of his life, until the final 6 months of his life, he never thought anything he did was really that worthwhile anyway. And he ended his life with an almost 20-year case of writer's block, in large part because he just felt like, well, nothing I do is even as good as the last thing I did. And the last thing he did was Sleuth, which was pretty good, and for which he liked to joke both. He was the only director in history whose entire cast had been nominated for Academy Awards, since both Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine were nominated for Oscars for that film. But he couldn't even compete with that, and he thought that was sort of a trifle. And finally, he had a breakthrough late in life where he realized, I guess I did a couple of good things. It's okay. And he let himself off the hook in the final few months of his life. He was writing again. So that's it. I'd love to take questions if there are any, or of course I could just keep expounding. But maybe Alice, if there are questions, or if there are any in that chat thing, I'm happy to answer.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So let's see. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any questions in chat, but let's look at the cameras. If anybody have any questions, feel free to turn on your camera. If you want to raise your hand, and let's see. This recording, I'm looking at the chat right now. This recording has been recorded. It is recorded. We will clean it up, and it will be on the library's YouTube channel, and we will be sharing it. We'll be sharing to Nick so he can share it to anybody who's not able to attend. And so we got chat feedback. Thank you, Nick, for a great talk, and Beverly Hills for putting this on. Thank you so much for Michelle for that. Elena said, it's a good thing that this presentation has been recorded. It's wonderful documentary of your experience and point of view. Great for your family archives in addition to show business history. Mark has a question. Okay, let's see. Mark, if you want to unmute yourself, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Okay.
Mute. Hey, Nick, it's Mark Quinn. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. It's nice
to see you. Okay.
Yes, I can
nice
hear you.
To see you. Okay, good. My question is about Herman. Did he have ambitions late in life to write an account of his life, the way that, like, you showed a picture of him with Ben Hecht, and Ben Hecht famously had this Child of the Century book, same sort of, progression of these great moments, cultural moments, the 1920s writing for newspapers, and then getting sucked up into Hollywood and writing a lot of early movies. Did he have notes towards that? Or was he just at that point kind of a little too dissolute and not really?
That's a great question. I think, the last great thing he tried to do was a movie. He tried to there were a couple of, he kept sort of trying. Like, he would say, all right, I'm going to write a play. And he would sort of write the first act of a play. It would be pretty good. And then the second act wouldn't work out,
Right.
And in the early 30s, he had this thing where he wanted to take on Hitler. So he wrote this screenplay, and he had this whole plan where he was going to write a movie about Hitler, even though all of the Hollywood studios were, dependent on German, on the German foreign market. And so it was never going to happen. The studio heads would never do it. But he spent years developing this movie on Hitler. And in the late 40s, he sort of had an idea. I'm going to do a screenplay about a woman who is based on Amy Semple McPherson, and I'm going to attack organized religion the way I did journalism in Citizen Kane. But I don't know of any autobiography or memoiristic ambitions that he ever had. I think when he would become ambitious, it was to do work again, like the work he'd always done. But I wish he had. Actually, I said when the book began, but I had an idea for a novel in 1990, which was going to be Herman writing letters about his life to my mother. And then those letters were going to be delivered to me on my 21st birthday or something. I mean, it was, that didn't work out. But clearly I've been thinking about all this a long time, but I don't know that Herman did. I mean, Joe was taking notes. Interestingly, Joe agreed to have his biography done by this man, Ken Geist, in the, I should say this, in the 70s. Both Herman and Joe had biographies written about them in the 70s. And the two authors of those books, Ken Geist wrote one on Joe, and a man named Richard Merriman wrote one on Herman. They conducted all these interviews with hundreds and hundreds of people who actually knew Joe and Herman. And both those guys, those authors, gave me all their tapes and their transcripts. Yeah. So I actually listened to a lot of them and read all the transcripts of all of those interviews. They only used a portion of them in their books. And I got to use stuff, and so I did feel like I got to know them even better through that. But anyway, Joe ended up hating that book by Geist, and hated Geist, and said, well, I'm going to do my own biography someday. And he was taking notes towards that when he passed away. But yeah, I mean, I would love to have read those accounts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think Paula may have a question, and we also have a question in the chat. So we'll let Paula ask her question first.
Hey, Nick.
Hi, Paula.
Very good to have you in LA. As you know, I'm probably one of the rare people who read this book despite really disliking Citizen Kane. But I'm on chapter 7, listening to you read it, and am particularly fascinated by the family dynamics. And what I'm wanting to know, you sort of kind of tipped off in your last response, which was, I'm trying to get a better understanding of the research, because there's so much detail here. It's so exhaustive. And if you could just share.
Yes, it's exhausting.
All of it. If you give us a little glimpse into maybe a high and a low of the process of gathering the information, almost sort of apart from the writing, but the research part.
Well, I think one of the highs was discovering this section of my grandmother's interview with Richard Merriman that he didn't use. And it's this incredible story of Joe was not a good husband. I mean, neither of them were great husbands, but Joe proved himself. Actually, and I shouldn't say that. Joe, with his third wife, I think, was a very good husband, and he sort of had a good third marriage. But previous to that, he played around like a maniac. I don't think he was forcing himself on people. I think he was just a rapscallion in the way that Hollywood figures were back then. And he had affairs with all his leading ladies and stuff like that. Herman did not fool around. He wasn't a good husband, but he did not fool around. But he did have one almost dalliance. And this, what's that?
Mm-mm.
Well, anyway, Herman had one almost dalliance, and my grandmother told Dick Merriman about it, and that was the aha. I was like, wait a minute, why isn't this in Dick's book? It's an incredible story, and it's very revelatory. And she comes in on Herman in a clinch with a secretary in London, and then it leads to this huge fight, and then a wonderful getting back together. And he didn't include it in his book. And I can only imagine, because unfortunately he passed away, Richard Merriman, or I would have asked him, like, what the hell, man, this is like the best thing. And it's not in your book. I didn't find that, or you know what, I found it early and I knew I was going to use it, but I never thought to ask Dick until he died, hey, why didn't you put this in? And I can only assume it was because he was a very nice man. And my grandmother must have asked him later, like, hey, don't include that, and she wouldn't have said it like that. She was a very stern woman herself, and she could be very scary. At least to me, she was very scary, Goma. And so that was a high, was sort of discovering stuff and that happened all the time. Stuff, little things, little details like, oh, Herman liked liverwurst. Oh, that's good. I mean, I don't know where I'm ever going to use that. I'm not sure I got around to putting that in. I hate liverwurst, and that's a way.
Love liverwurst.
I'm not like Herman, but there were this like little things, all that I was able to scatter throughout. And as for the lows, well, I think the low was when my editor said, no, you're not done. Like, this is not the book, and I don't want this book, and nobody's going to want this book about you, and just take yourself out, and we'll be there. And I was just like so resistant, and I just didn't want to think that I had more work to do, because it was a lot of work to get to the point, to that point. So I think that was the low. And then, but I think for the most part, the high, the real high was, other than just discovering that, the high was getting to the point of realizing, oh, I got this. I can do this. I know this. I understand this book, and I'm now writing it. And then I'm just, I've been overjoyed with it out in the world. And it's not, and I'm happy when people like it. And if they don't, sorry, did what I could. It only took me 19 years. So if you don't like it, maybe I should have spent longer. There's just not much I can do about it, but I feel very happy having written this thing and tossing it out into the world. And so that's the,
thank you.
That was a long,
thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, Nick, we have one other question in the chat from Linda. What did you think of the 2020 film Mank and their take on both Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I am the last person in the world whose opinion I trust about the movie Mank, because I will agree with anything anybody says about that movie. I'm a total reed in the wind. If you come to me and you say, wasn't it great? Wasn't it so beautiful? Isn't it a perfect evocation of Hollywood in the 30s and this loving, recreation of the style and the look, and the black and white is so gorgeous, and the little cigarette holes in the corners of the reels on the reel change, and wasn't, weren't the performances so well observed and loving and magnificent? I'd say, yes. Oh, totally agree with you. And if, on the other hand, you come to me and say, God, could you even follow what was going on? And it was so hard to hear, and it was sort of dramatically inert, and they're just stuck out there forever. And really, Herman finishes the script, and he doesn't go back to Los Angeles to see his wife and kids, and he just stays there while it's like a one-act play, and people come and call on him. I'd say, yeah, that's true. But it's very churlish for me to in any way object to a movie. As I was saying before, I think that's like the fact of the movie made me so happy. Like, I love the fact of it, and the fact that they got, one of the world's greatest actors, and he gives a warm and wise and funny performance as sort of a combination of, Bugs Bunny and Shakespeare and Oscar Schindler. I mean, that's pretty good. Now, was that my grandfather? As my cousin John, he was like, well, it's somebody's grandfather. It's not my grandfather. Like, it didn't seem like my Herman Mankiewicz, but, it's okay. It's a movie. And having written, my own version, it doesn't bother me. It didn't take away from me. I did think that the guy who played Orson Welles was magnificent. And did about as good a job as conveying what Welles's protean presence must have been like, as you can imagine any actor doing. So I wish I had an easier answer. My cousins all have easier answers. Ben loves it. Ben Mankiewicz just loved the film. He just loved it. And other cousins are like, well, that's not my grandfather. So. But I'm just so happy they did it. And I mean, you wait long enough, you work on your own book for 20 years. Eventually someone's going to come out with a movie about the guy, so people will know who your book is about. So it's all good. Anyway, I don't know if there are any other questions, but I saw, I'm very nearsighted, but I think somebody in the chat went to high school with my mom or something, which is amazing. So that's pretty great. Thank you for having me. If there are no more questions, even if there are more questions, I can answer them, but thank you for having me anyway.
Okay, well, I think that's it. If there's no more questions, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Nick. I did want to say, everybody, you'll have a chance. I did hear that Nick Davis will be joining us in Los Angeles for Festival of Books in April, I
Yes.
believe. Right. I did want to
Yes.
make a plug for that. So you'll actually get to meet him in person. Normally, when we do have an author event, as COVID things are lifted, we do have in-person events. We would have a book signing. Unfortunately, we don't have that here. So if you would like to meet him in person, please come to LA Festival of Books. It's the first one they're having since the pandemic. You can actually purchase the book. You can have him sign it. You can meet him in person. That would be awesome. So please come out, to USC.
There's a panel. I should say I'm doing a panel with two other authors, and I'm forgetting who they are, but they're good. They're good. One, I think maybe Dana Stevens, who did the Buster Keaton book, which
nice.
looked great. And I am not remembering the other, but it's also a really cool movie-ish kind of book.
It's the new Buster Keaton biography that's coming out, right? It's the person.
The new Buster Keaton. There are two Buster Keaton biographies out right now that are both supposed to be good. And I'm doing one with one of them. And I'm sorry, I'm not remembering who the other author is. It's terrible.
Well, it doesn't matter. Just come out for Nick Davis. Okay, we'll cut this part out. Okay, no problem. All right. So please come out for that.
Great.
And thank you so much. And we hope to see you again. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great evening,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.